Tolkien fans rejoice because we have a new Lord of the Rings film adaptation coming from Warner Brothers. Most importantly, the gang is reuniting with Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, Philippa Boyens producing the film, and Andy Serkis directing and reprising his role as Gollum. Plus, Weta Workshops will be back to help with the special effects, so many fans like myself are already pontificating what direction they'll take with this new film. Jackson gave us a little hint by saying, quote, "It's too soon to know who will cross Gollum's path, but suffice to say, we will take our lead from Professor Tolkien. Let's put ourselves in the writing room and producing room and realistically put together a plot that will work both as a production and adaptation. We'll look at the goal of the film, the limitations that we'll face as creators of the project, and a beat-by-beat plot that we hope to hand to actors and a production team." All right, let's start with the goal for The Hunt for Gollum. Like every franchise property adapted into a film, the overarching purpose is to make money more than the film costs to produce, adding profit to the parent organization. Warner Brothers' tentpole properties such as DC and Harry Potter have struggled at the box office for the past 10 years, so it makes sense that returning to the cash cow of Lord of the Rings is a good move. The good news for Tolkien fans is that the studio drama that plagued the Hobbit production hopefully won't happen this time. I can assume Peter Jackson isn't taking a break from his Beatles projects and come back to Middle-earth without assurances that him and the team will have full creative control. But that doesn't mean the studio would be okay with a solo Tom Bombadil film, as much as I'd like it. But they want something marketable. They want something that can incorporate into the nostalgia of the original trilogy and probably see characters, aka actors, that the audiences are used to or will pay money to go see again. For the creators, the tone in the press materials and Boyan's recent interview with the Nerd of the Rings channel, it's obvious that this group has unfinished business in Middle-earth. This means that they've learned their lessons from the Hobbit films and are looking to do the opposite of the two trilogies and tell a more grounded story in Tolkien's lore, which is in this material probably darker and more of a serious tone than adaptations so far. Instead of trying to one-up the scale and drama of The Lord of the Rings, they're going to delve deep into the lore that makes so many fans like myself pore over Tolkien's works like sacred texts. The best comparison that we have with the creator's viewpoint and what they're trying to achieve is a fellow franchise, Star Wars, specifically the most lauded film by fans and critics during the Disney age, Rogue One. But that's where the limitations of this exercise begins, and it's something we're going to have to figure out. Unlike Rogue One, which used primarily new characters besides a few deepfake cameos, The Hunt for Gollum will need to include the big players in the Third Age of Middle-earth. Sourcing from the text and dependencies of The Lord of the Rings, the period after Gollum loses the ring to Bilbo in The Hobbit to when he first appears in Moria, he could potentially interact with Gandalf, Aragorn, Thranduil, Legolas, Galadriel, Shelob, and Sauron himself. That makes casting critical. Now, we can confirm that Serkis as Gollum is a lock at this point. But we can also assume that the beacons will be lit for the original cast interests. Most importantly, Ian McKellen as Gandalf and Viggo Mortensen as Strider/Aragorn. McKellen seems like priority one for me if I'm in the room, and he's the first person I'm calling, begging to return. Even at his age, he's still sprite and youthful, currently doing plays in West End and active on social media. Getting him to don the great cloak, beard, and pointy hat again will help ground the fans into Jackson's Middle-earth we know and love. In the books, Aragorn is well into his 70s, but the on-screen Viggo that played him 20 years ago was in his 40s. However, Viggo is aging like a fine Numenorean wine. The aging special effects have mixed results, but if there's anyone that can figure it out, a solution between CGI and practical, it's Weta Workshops. For me, Viggo's involvement is a zero-sum game, both as the actor who played Aragorn, but also as an artist, a mentor, someone who's directing films himself. If we get him committed, the floodgates open for the original cast involvement, and I think everyone will all be all in if Viggo's in. But if he says no and is recast with a younger actor, which I totally think is an okay move, I suggest resisting the temptation to add old cast members besides McKellen. McKellen and Serkis ground us enough It might be jarring to throw in a whole ensemble for nostalgia's sake without Vigo at the center. The other limitation of this adaptation is, as writers, we'll want to source from the book, but we also need to follow the continuity of the original series. Rogue One, or even the fan film Hunt for Gollum made in 2009, didn't have this much to struggle with between the continuity of the books and the film franchise. This puts us into a bit of a pickle because the period from Bilbo's 111th birthday celebration and when Frodo embarks from the Shire is 17 years in the books, but in the films, it only feels like a couple of weeks. Fortunately, there are no official timestamps in the film, so the feeling of time doesn't dictate actual time in the story. It's the same idea that Peter Jackson claims that just because they didn't show the Old Forest doesn't mean that the hobbits didn't interact with Old Willow, Tom Bombadil, Goldberry, and the Barrow-wights. The main continuity we need to follow to match the films is Gandalf's journey. After he leaves Frodo with the ring at Bag End, following Bilbo's birthday party, he heads to Minas Tirith to research the lore of the One Ring, then return to the Shire to make his final test as well as share with Frodo a critical line that we'll need to follow as writers. I looked everywhere for the creature Gollum, but the enemy found him first. Gandalf also says that through the torture, Gollum revealed Shire Baggins. That's specifically to the films, not accurate to the books. After sending off Frodo and Sam, Gandalf heads to Isengard where he's betrayed by Sauron. So we will need to fit our story within that travel timeline. Doesn't mean it has to happen all at the same time. We could have just gotten glimpses of it in Jackson's first film. The other core continuity we will need to follow is Aragorn's arc from reluctant banished ranger to King Elisar. This film needs to set up the beginning of the arc where we first meet him in Bree. That's when we're thinking about the plot, we need to ask the question, whose perspective are we telling in this story? In The Lord of the Rings, it's primarily Frodo, and in the Hobbit trilogy, it's Bilbo. However, both those trilogies have adjoining perspectives. In The Lord of the Rings, it's Aragorn, and in The Hobbit, it's Thorin. In this story, especially with Circus at the helms, we can expect Gollum to get much more of an intimate treatment as a character. But this is more than a villain origin retelling like Cruella or Wicked. To tell this story, our secondary lead character has to be Aragorn. An unlikely duo, to be sure, but you'll see there's more in common with these two characters than meets the eye of Sauron. All right, now that we have the ground rules laid out, let's dive into what we're going to do to make The Hunt for Gollum a money-making blockbuster for the studio, expand the legacy of Jackson's Middle-earth adaptations, and tie seamlessly into the original series continuity. Here we go. We open the film with an idyllic domestic shot of what appears to be a Hobbiton-like village along the coast of a river. As the camera maneuvers through the hovels, gardens, and boathouses, we discover a commotion coming near the edge of town. We see a gathered group of hobbit-like creatures staring at a shape at the edge of the forest. An elderly woman is perched over the shape. She berates the shape and yells at him to be gone and never to return. The shape begins wailing. It's Smeagol, already beginning to transfigure into a creature unrecognizable to his community. The shocked and fearful faces of staring townspeople watch as Smeagol slowly begins to crawling into the woods, crying and yelling. Cut on the audio of his screaming to Gollum in his cave in the Misty Mountains. He's mourning the loss of his precious and cursing the thief who stole it. Eventually, Gollum begins talking to himself, giving him a pep talk to leave the cave that's been his home for decades. Out of anger and pull of the ring, he does leave, and we see Gollum crawling from the mountains, reeling from the light. The camera moves from the crawling creature to a wide shot of the mountains, so we barely see the spider-like creature crawling over the rocks. The title screen fades in, Lord of the Rings, The Hunt for Gollum. Cut to a dark forest where a mysterious shrouded man is tracking something in the woods. This is our introduction to Strider, aka Aragorn, who can reveal himself in a pull of a hood dramatic fashion. He's tracking spies of Sauron in the wilderness of the north. This is our first action scene, and we'll have Strider track down a gang of ruffian spies. Maybe he'll dramatically be pinned by three burly dudes when his ranger buddies come to the rescue. I'm super pumped about this scene because we'll actually get to see and meet the Númenórean Rangers that Strider leads. After they slay or scare off the bad guys, maybe we'll get a cool line that Strider says to one of the captured ruffians like, "The evil whom you serve does not quarter betrayers in any living being." After reuniting with his rangers, we learn that Strider has been in Eriador in the north visiting his mother. We see a flashback of a tender moment at the bedside of his ill mother, where she pleads for him to find love again. We can even quote right from the appendices here, where his mother says, "I gave hope to the Dunedain. I have kept no hope for myself." Here we see a removed man who's been living in the wilderness for years, totally detached from people, lineage, and humanity. Strider's response to his ancestry is to flee. So the two main characters in this film, Gollum and Aragorn, both have begun with a loss, and both are tied to the fate of the ring. Both are burdened by it. Gollum, the actual power and lust for the ring as the ring bearer, and Aragorn, the descendant of Isildur, bearing the burden of a dying kingdom and failed promises. The Rangers say they found Strider in the wilderness because they were trying to bring him a message to meet a stranger with a bushy beard, eyebrows, and gray cloak and hat. Strider meets Gandalf at the Prancing Pony, a familiar location for fans, and here's where Gandalf sets Strider on the quest to find Gollum. Strider can even say the line straight from the Council of Elrond chapter in Fellowship of the Ring, quote, "It seems fitting that Isildur's heir should labor to repair Isildur's fault." That is the motivation of this film for Aragorn. It's great that we can just source it straight from Tolkien himself. Now, depending on how much Ian McKellen is able to do for this film, we could either have him head straight to Minas Tirith to do research or accompany Strider on the first leg of the quest. I'm opting him to stay with Strider a bit longer so we can have this gorgeous montage of these two sexy men riding across the landscape of New Zealand, questioning locals as they search for Gollum. For executives, this will feel a lot like when the Fellowship start their journey and sets up these two as the main leaders of the company because they've crossed this terrain before. After the montage, we will have a scene at a small village on the edge of Mirkwood. This is where Jackson and Circus can lean into their creepy factor. It should feel like a ghost town. Eventually, Gandalf and Strider find someone willing to talk, and they share stories of a vampiric creature in the woods stalking prey in the night and even taking babies from their cradles. After the creepy story, we cut to a rocky pass with dark skies and flashes of red. We're back in Mordor, baby. We are in the first-person view of someone being pursued by orcs. We feel the terror of the approaching band as the camera swerves through rock ledges and crevasses. Then a dark hole is before the camera. The camera spins and reveals that Gollum is the one being chased. He waits patiently for the orcs until they see him, then smirks. Gollum is leading the orcs into Shelob's lair. We see a delightful Gollum cheer on Shelob as she devours the orcs. Then we do a couple of cuts of Gollum's bleak but idyllic life on the edge of Mordor, finding a fish or two, exploring trapping of orcs. It's almost as if he's forgotten about the ring. But one day in Mordor, Gollum is doing his daily sneaking, and this time he gets captured by a different type of orc. And maybe they appear closer to Uruk-hai or orc hunters. I'll let Weta figure that out. And Gollum hasn't run into these type of orcs, and he's captured and brought to the Tower of Barad-dûr. For the first time, audiences will get to see a behind the curtain of one of the most powerful strongholds of the Third Age. We see all the war preparations and Gollum's witness to the scale of Sauron's desire to find the ring. Then a tough scene, Gollum's torture. We have to have this in the film, and this is where audiences are going to be most sympathetic to Gollum. It will be hard to watch, but an important watch, because it will replicate the scene from the Fellowship when Gollum cries out, "Shire Baggins," except this time, we will see the desperation on Gollum's face. We're back to Strider and Gandalf as they travel through Mirkwood to the halls of Thranduil, with Lee Pace returning as the fabulous elf daddy in charge. Thranduil is not happy to see Gandalf again, considering his last quest brought a large-scale conflict to his kingdom, so he's reluctant to help Gandalf find Gollum or heed his warnings of the enemy's movements. However, Legolas, his son, is buddies with Aragorn and advocates on their behalf. Now, this is tricky because at the end of The Hobbit, there is one of the worst errors in Jackson's adaptation when Thranduil tells Legolas to go find the Ranger in the North, which at the time meant Aragorn would have been a preteen, maybe 11 years old. But we're going to ignore that error and just assume Legolas and Strider have hung out before. Gandalf and Strider learned that a creature resembling Gollum was indeed witnessed in Mirkwood and Dale, but has not been seen for some time. Over dinner, they discuss the implications of the Ring of Power, and Thranduil suggests that the only way to truly trace the ring's lineage is to go to the Sorth, the archives at Minas Tirith. This is where Gandalf is starting to doubt the story of Saruman. Unfortunately, we are unable to have Christopher Lee back for a cameo, and I really hope we just do not try to do a replication in CGI, but we can have Gandalf reference Saruman as the person who he trusted, who told him the lore of the ring that was lost in the Anduin River. The Anduin River is like a character of this whole thing. After dinner, Gandalf insists that Minas Tirith should be the duo's next stop, but Strider is hesitant. He hides his conflict by saying he wants to follow his hunch that if Gollum truly senses the ring's power, wouldn't he also be drawn to the source of its maker? Gandalf can read between the lines and gives him a pep talk. He tells Strider that one day he will have to return to the White Tower, however terrifying or trying it may be. Gandalf believes that unlike Isildur, he will make the right choice. Gandalf leaves for Minas Tirith and they plan to meet back here in Mirkwood no matter what happens. While Strider spends time in the halls of Thranduil, we see a flashback of his own childhood growing up in Rivendell with his mother. Maybe we can have some dialogue between Elrond and his mother, the conflict of them and his lineage and what he's supposed to do, how he's supposed to learn. In the midst of Strider's contemplation and flashback, Legolas interrupts him and tells him that he's been granted permission to lead him to the edge of Mirkwood. As these friends travel together, Legolas senses Strider's somberness. Assuming these bros have had a few heart-to-hearts over the campfire, Legolas says, "Lady Arwen will wait for you, my friend." Strider brushes him off and says he is forbidden to marry her unless the king reclaims the crown. "And is that not your birthright?" Legolas says. Strider is silent. "My friend, I know the weight of lineage, and I don't mean to lead you astray, but the kingdom of Mirkwood will not tip the scale in the weight of evil in this world. Gondor will." "And you think it is me that can wield this power?" Strider protests. "Not wield, but protect," Legolas says. The two friends embrace at the edge of Mirkwood. As Strider departs, another flashback happens. This time, he's departing Rivendell for the wilderness as a young man. Here we get a cameo from Liv Tyler as Arwen, with Elrond looming in the backdrop. Strider does what he does best, escape into the wild. We see the looming mountains of Mordor as Strider departs, alone this time. Cut to Minas Tirith, where Gandalf enters the city and is hailed as Mithrandir. Ideally, we get a short scene of Denethor begrudgingly letting Gandalf enter the archives and do some research. Now we have a cut-cross montage of Gandalf searching through the archives and Strider maneuvering so close to Mordor that he can see Minas Morgul. As both characters get closer to the truth of Mordor's terror, we see a shot of Gollum in Barad-dûr, in pain. Here's where the film continuity is tricky. Jackson's adaptation claims that Sauron can't take human form, so this scene is going to have to interpret Sauron as a whispering voice or mist. But we are going to show him as a deceiver, not this big eye in the sky. After days and weeks of torture, Sauron doesn't think he can get any more from the creature, so Sauron plays a more deceptive tactic. Instead of pain and torture, Sauron fans the flames of Gollum's hatred for the thief who took the ring. Gollum soon goes from fear to anger, crying out against the thief who took it. Sauron's deception fuels Gollum once again to find his precious. We see Gollum finally released by the orcs out into the edges of Mordor. Meanwhile, Strider can't find a trace of Gollum. While in Ithilien, he does find men being assaulted by a band of orcs. Strider jumps in to rescue these men like Batman, totally saving their butts. In the heat of battle, Strider comes sword to sword with one of the men. He reveals himself to be no other than Captain of Gondor, Faramir. Now, I know this is a big leap from the source material, but if we're bringing the band back together and Strider's in the area, why not bring back David Wenham as the lovable Gondorian younger brother with daddy issues? Strider doesn't reveal his real name, except that he's a Dunedain of the North on a mission by Mithrandir, tracking a servant of Sauron. Strider says his hunt has gone cold and asks Faramir to bring a message to Mithrandir to return to their meeting place. The two kinsmen depart with mutual respect. I think it's important to include this scene because we need a touch point of Strider with his kinsmen. We need him to get close to Gondor, but not actually be there. We need him to have a glimpse. Really, he's only hung out in the wilderness, maybe interacted with the Dunedain for years. So for him, interacting with a true Gondorian is going to help him realize that he needs to take up this calling eventually. Near the edges of the Dead Marshes, our two heroes finally meet. Strider discovers strange footprints in the mud near the marshes, not beast, man, or orc, but something different. He finally spots Gollum fishing in the marshes. He captures him after an intense chase through the lights and mist. Strider ties Gollum with some elven ropes and begins his journey back to Mirkwood. Like the book, the two cross the Anduin. This is going to be an intense adventure scene. I can see it being shot in New Zealand practically. It's going to be a great shot. It's going to be a fun action scene. In the book, Strider does take Gollum through Lorien, but I think at this point we need to keep up the pace of the plot, and there's a more important stop I want to make for these characters. As they make their way up the Anduin, the two unlikely companions stop to camp in a familiar place. It's near Gollum's original home as Smeagol. In a tender campfire scene, Gollum shares fragments of his life as Smeagol, including how he was ostracized, mocked, and eventually shunned by his own family and community. We see it as a flashback as the viewers. Strider begins to empathize more with the creature, seeing how the ring's influence forced Gollum into the wild, much like himself. And we'll let Viggo's incredible acting silently tell us everything in the glow of the firelight. In the book, the Baorians help Strider and Gollum cross the Anduin again, which we can include, but this time let's make it more of an action scene as they're pursued by goblins from the Misty Mountain. Eventually, they return to Mirkwood, and Strider and Gandalf are reunited. Thranduil is not happy to host Gollum, but he relents. It's here where we see a very different interrogation scene, Gandalf and Gollum. And here we go, Gandalf and Gollum, head to head, two of the great actors of our time, going at it, giving it their all. In this scene, Gandalf ties all the pieces together, the history of the ring from Gondor, Gollum's finding of the ring, and Bilbo's eventual discovery. He's now 99% certain that in the Shire, Frodo is keeping the One Ring secret and safe. With haste, Gandalf pleads with Thranduil to guard Gollum in his halls and treat him well. Then he and Strider make a plan. Gandalf will head back to the Shire and confirm his deepest fears. If it's true, he will instruct Frodo to leave the Shire immediately while he consults Saruman. Meanwhile, Strider will make his way north and put the Rangers on guard at the edge of the Shire. Gandalf says to be on the lookout for Frodo and that he will know to meet at the Prancing Pony in Bree. Gandalf leaves Mirkwood and suggests Strider take a rest in Mirkwood to renew his strength after the long journey with Gollum. Cut to Minas Morgul, we see the Nazgul mission prepping with their gear and a horde of orcs moving from Mordor under the cover of darkness. Then we have our final scene with Strider and Gollum. The two characters who started the film with loss are finding their purpose again. Strider has returned to the world, rekindled with his kinsmen, remembered the faith of his friends, and sees Gollum and how horrible the ring's hold can be on an individual, but also a mass scale. For Gollum, he has faced a journey of loss, getting glimpses of his ancient life before the ring, and he's come face to face with the Dark Lord and renewed his pursuit of the ring. Unlike Strider, Gollum is going back to the thing that has destroyed him. Strider visits Gollum in his cell and finally shares a bit of himself, saying that his ancestor once too loved his precious, but it destroyed everything. He describes the great kings of men who were promised so much by Sauron, but are now just his servants of shadow. He says that the precious is only loyal to the Lord of the Rings. We are all just being used and tormented by it. Gollum shows a glimpse of fear and understanding, and reveals that they're coming, the Dark Ones, the Wraiths. Strider is stunned. Just at that moment, an alarm is sounded in the halls of Thranduil. Now, in the book, Strider leaves Mirkwood before the orcs attack, and there's this whole scene of the elves trying to rehab Gollum, and I think at this point in the movie, we need a climactic action scene, and our lead character needs to be a part of it. Okay, we have an orc attack and battle in Mirkwood. Strider joins the fight alongside Legolas and Thranduil. The battle is intense and in the dark. In the midst of this chaos, Gollum's cage is damaged, and he escapes into the darkness of the woods. Thranduil's forces, alongside the help of Strider, push back the orcs to the edges of the kingdom. Strider reveals that this must have been a diversion for the Nine to be able to cross the Anduin, and we see a montage of the race riding at night with the Anduin in the background. Strider says he must return to the north because he knows where they're going. Thranduil, with more respect and admiration for Strider, bids him adieu before leaving to finish off with his elf legions. Legolas embraces him, and the two friends promise they'll meet again. We enter a final montage of the puzzle pieces coming together in this prequel. Here we can have a dramatic voiceover from Cate Blanchett, closing out the hunt for Gollum and setting up what will be the Fellowship. This seamlessly connects her voiceover narration into the first film's intro. Cut to Gandalf entering the Shire on horse in the evening and walking up to Bag End to wait for Frodo. Cut to Legolas killing off the last of the orcs. Cut to Strider on horseback headed north. Cut to Gollum crossing the Anduin. Cut to Legolas inspecting the cells after the battle, realizing that Gollum has escaped. Cut to Strider back in the north instructing his rangers. Cut to Gollum returning into the mountains in a contrasting shot from the opening of the film. Then we fade to black. Blanchett's narration ends saying, "A ranger returns from the wilderness to give his sword to the most unexpected of creatures, a hobbit from the Shire. Outside of Bree, we see 4 cloaked travelers weaving through the woods. Strider watches them from a distance as thunder starts to roar. Cut to the prancing pony, where Strider enters like an old Western character. The patrons look at him with fear and disgust. He orders an ale, finds a dark corner, lifts up his feet, and lights his pipe, staring at the entryway. He sees the back of the innkeeper perched over at the bar talking to new patrons. Strider sees 8 bare feet caked with mud and hair. The band turns the corner, and we see the original cast of the 4 hobbits finding a table and sitting down. In slow motion, as their food and drink are served, we see Frodo lift his head and lock eyes with Strider. The smoke from Strider's pipe illuminates his eye in a glow of red. Fade to black and end credits. Thanks for joining me on this quest, this experiment. Now, what did we miss? Are there any additional characters we could sneak into this film, plot lines that you think we should delve into more? What's your suggestion for the creative team helming this adaptation? Let me know in the comments.